generation of console gaming was an awkward transition period, as gaming has adopted 3D exclusivity as the norm instead of an occasional release like it was back in the early 90s with games like Star Fox for the Super Nintendo, as well as various computer games. And with the release of the Nintendo 64, that console was definitely no exception to this rule. Every series that was still going and kicking got a 3D installment. In fact, Super Mario and Pilot Wings were the first of Nintendo's franchises to make the leap to 3D on the new 64-bit console, and eventually The Legend of Zelda and Donkey Kong Country followed suit. So in December of 1996, the sequel Super Mario Kart fans were waiting for finally came out, and this was a big deal because it allowed for up to 4 players to compete against each other in 16 racetracks in actual 3D. And sure, we take that for granted nowadays, but for the longest time, there were only 2 players, with a few occasional exceptions, and while 4-player split screen can really cramp up the screen real estate, especially for CRT TV, it is something that can bring the whole family together on a Friday night. And it all started development in 1995 as Super Mario Kart R, once again under the direction of Hideki Kono, with Shigeru Miyamoto serving as producer. They intended to make this a launch title for their 3D Nintendo 64 console, but they needed just a bit more time, and so they released it months later for the holiday season in North America. Suffice to say, the Mario Kart series has given me and many others so much joy over almost 3 decades. That's not to say that it didn't have its low points, but more often than not, it was a high point on the console it launched for. And Mario Kart 64 is not one of those games, unfortunately, at least in retrospect. As always, I'm Alec the Sidequestian Gentleman here, and I'm going to take a deep dive into this, just to see why it hasn't really held up all these years. Don't get me wrong, I like Mario Kart 64, and I'm very sure that back then it was a phenomenon to have a kart racing game in full 3D. Well, kind of. But playing it now, it has many issues that prevent me from calling it one of my favorite Nintendo 64 titles, and this has honestly been the case for me for almost 10 years, because when I first played it back in high school during my retro gaming craze that I was going through, Mario Kart 7 just came out, and by then, I had experience with DS, Wii, and Super Mario Kart. And the internet back then, as opposed to now, was a lot different, even in the YouTube days. 2012 was back when YouTubers like Game Trailers and Screw Attack, as well as the Hidden Block and Normal Boots YouTubers, were the arbiters of the conversation. And while it was far from unanimous, back then, Mario Kart 64 was seen as the crown jewel of the series. But flash forward to now, when younger generations started throwing their hat into the Mario Kart ring, people seem to be more openly critical of Mario Kart 64, citing the improvements of each installment since then, whether it be power-ups, balancing, or just track design in general. Even among fans, the rubber banding has especially been openly criticized. And I'm not gonna lie, as someone who didn't get Mario Kart 64 and would occasionally be bombarded with fallacious, "You kids are so spoiled, you're too young to know how good Mario Kart 64 was," types of statements by internet strangers whose word is about as valuable as discount powdered milk, it was kind of satisfying to see this game get ripped a new one. Like, suck it, ass. I'm not the only one. I know that's extremely petty on my part, but seeing the product of worship by people who were being dicks to detractors like me, it was extremely vindicating. Now they know how it feels to be on the receiving end of the unpopular opinion. So, I used to consider it the absolute worst Mario Kart game because of how empty it left me after finishing all the cups on 50cc, having no interest to ever play it again or even on the higher CCs. But then I actually sat down and dove deep into the predecessor, and when I finished getting footage for that game, I played this game immediately after to see if my original impressions of 64 still held up. And I can only answer that with yes and mostly no. No, because my original playthrough suffered from player ignorance on my part, because honestly, I didn't know you could drift boost in this game until my friend Hooray taught me how it works. I mean, it's not my fault as I didn't have the manual, and the game itself doesn't really tutorialize it at all, despite tutorialization being the norm by the time it came out. But with this newfound knowledge, I definitely had more fun with the game, and a lot of the track's curved nature seemed to encourage the use of this new feature. But as fun as drift boosting is, it could only do so much before the other problems I had with it resurfaced, revalidating a lot of my initial impressions of the game. Look, I'm not going to deny that Mario Kart 64 is a very important game in gaming history. It was the very first Mario Kart game to be brought into the third dimension. But with it being in the 5th generation of console gaming, it also means it's going through the growing pains of early 3D gaming as developers are trying to figure out just how to incorporate the famous 2D gameplay of their famous series into the third dimension. How do they translate that? First things first, I still get excited when I see the Nintendo logo spinning in full 3D, and immediately after I get a slap to the face with a rotten piece of bologna, because look at this title. It's just a boring still image that has not aged well graphically speaking. I mean, to be fair, the SNES game is the only one with a cool animated intro, but in this day and age, it looks horrible. And that's just one part of the inconsistent graphical style of the game, because I like the low poly landscapes of the snowy tracks, especially seeing all the reused Super Mario 64 assets like the penguins, the thwomp enemies, and even Peach's castle. Even though the low poly art style could be seen as just bland or uninspired, I think the arrangement of slopes, foliage, and in-game objects like the boulders and giant eggs make these tracks very memorable in terms of appearance. I also really like the use of color, as even the rockier landscapes never bore me with their appearance, except maybe Wario Stadium for the overuse of the dirt texture. Then again, I was never into monster trucks, so the inspiration wouldn't really appeal to my demographic. But I do like the reflection of the ice. I like how magical Rainbow Road looks with its spacey background and neon signs of the characters and objects. And I'm a sucker for the simple design of the highway in Toad Turnpike with its busy polygonal cars in the twilight sky. The levels just look so much more alive than the flat racetrack designs of the first game, because while some tracks feel like race car tracks, it mostly feels like improvised street racing in any area with a makeshift road. Something the first game only did occasionally, and thank God this becomes the new status quo for the series, because I kinda like the less racetracky designs of the later tracks, because now Mario Kart's tracks feel more grand in scope as well as adventurous. And that's all the nice things I have to say about the art style, so put on your adult pants because I'm going to rip the kart racer sprites a new one. What were they thinking? I get having billboarding sprites would use less memory than a fully modeled kart racer, and I understand that CRT TVs would blend the pixels and level geometry in a way where most people don't really care, but in the digital flat screen TV days, they look like a complete mess. They don't even look like they belong on this 3D landscape, and that's a damn shame. I wouldn't mind if they use high resolution sprites, but as it is, it aged rather poorly, and hindsight sure is a cruel mistress. Thank God Diddy Kong Racing had the right idea to use character models for their kart racers. Again, 1996 was a brave new world of hardware for Nintendo, and I get that, but that whole "it was good for the time" excuse only holds so much weight when you see how the first Need for Speed game on 3DO had a fully modeled car, so what exactly is Nintendo's excuse? If you're not trying to one-up the competitors, regardless of their financial success, then you are settling. You're not pushing the boundaries of what's possible. And if you've watched my channel in the past, you would notice that I'm pretty tolerant and generous of lesser graphical styles, as long as the art style still works for the game. But having sprites pretend to be 3D just doesn't mesh well with the real 3D landscapes, and that is ultimately the downfall of this game's art style. But the real question is, how does this game evolve the standards set in Super Mario Kart, besides the major aesthetic change being in the third dimension and all? Mario Kart 64 still follows Super Mario Kart's winning formula of having weapons and items drastically change the way you race in these tracks, whereas it's not just about being the fastest, but also the smartest with whatever you're given, especially from these mystery boxes. The banana items are back and serve the exact same function as last time, being stationary objects that spin out carts that collide into them. The green shells, with the exception of the triple green shell, can be aimed forward and backwards and ricochet off the walls and can flip carts over. The red shell can only be aimed forward regardless of whether you have 1 or 3 on hand, but they home in on the cart in front of you and can't be avoided unless the shell is deflected by a triple shell shield you can get from the red or green shells, or the banana even. But as for what's new power-up wise, Mario Kart 64 still follows Super's ranking system, whereas those ahead get less powerful items, while those way behind or mid-ranking get better weapons to even things out. And with that said, the red shells, green shells, and boost mushrooms can now have more than one. And this surprisingly changes things up more than you would think, because a deployed triple shell can serve as a shield against the other shells or projectiles, and even damage cars that come into your proximity. And the multiple bananas can really make things difficult for tailgaters. The shrinking thunderbolt is also back, and it's still annoying if you're on the receiving end of these, but at least you can still move ahead until you revert back to normal, and those who do use it are usually way behind anyways. Now, I know I neglected to discuss why I thought it was a lesser item in the Super Mario Kart review, so I apologize for that. 64's rendition works just as it did there, so I have no complaints. But as for the new items, I really like this false item box that tricks opponents into collecting it, only to be met with a flip. I just love this, and I wish it became a regular item, as it was only used in Mario Kart DS, and that's about it. There's also the golden mushroom that lower ranking kart racers can use over and over and over in hopes of not falling too far back. It could be exploited, but it never overstays its welcome and only gets me back up to 5th place at most, depending on how up ahead they are, because there is the rubber banding to factor in. However, because this is a limited time item that counts down when you activate it and is gone after like 10 seconds, you have to use it carefully, so the delicate balance is not affected. But you know what does affect the balance of the items? The first iteration of the blue shell, because if you rank lower, this blue shell can be used to knock out carts in the way, but specifically home in on the first placer, and from my knowledge, there's no way to avoid it, and it outright punishes the player up ahead for being first. Now, I ranted and raved about it a lot in the Super Mario Kart review because it becomes a series mainstay, but instead of traveling on the ground and knocking out carts it comes in contact with, it only homes in on the first placer, and the blast radius is the only thing that can possibly knock out the other racers in further installments. So with Mario Kart 64 and even Super Circuit for the Game Boy Advance, this iteration of the blue shell screws other racers up ahead, and not exclusively the first placer, unlike later installments after Super Circuit. So with the items, the original ones are still useful, and the new ones are quite useful, but there is one thing that is absent that would not only make all these tracks more engaging, but also reward players for their skill on the track. And that would be the coin mechanic. Why is it gone in this game? It was so well implemented in the original, it's only logical to, improve upon that. One of the little things I really liked about Super Mario Kart was the coin mechanic, because it's a simple yet meaningful idea. If you collect coins, your acceleration goes slightly higher, and if you're holding a lot of coins, that would be beneficial to you as a racer and further incentivize not to get hit by items or even fall down a pit and need Lakitu's help, because that could make you lose said coins. So their absence here is rather confusing. It's not like they couldn't bring it back for the sequel, as it worked before, and the ability to program coins just doesn't go away magically. And I seriously doubt it's an issue with memory, because Mario Kart 64 has reused many assets from Super Mario 64, so it is possible to use the rotating coin sprites from that game as well. Not to mention that Diddy Kong Racing was able to pull this off on the exact same console, except instead of the gold coins, they used bananas. And I should mention that Cape Feather was intended to be in this game, but they scrapped that idea, and that's fine by me, because needing an item to access a shortcut like in the original Super Mario Kart, instead of actually using your skill with drift boosting to reach it, is not my cup of tea anyways. So despite overall better items, the absence of the coins is disappointing, and the addition of the blue shell is a glaring stain that will forever curse the series, but at the very least, opponents can't use CPU exclusive items like Super Mario Kart did. And you would think that makes the game more fair than its predecessor, except there is one thing Mario Kart 64 is really infamous for when it comes to the CPU racer's performance in the race. Yeah, the rubber banding is horrible in this game. For those not familiar with the term, which I didn't know until watching a Jak 2 review, rubber banding is when a racing game or minigame makes a CPU racer you're against either go really fast to catch up with you, or slow down just so you can catch up with them. I hear it's a tactic to conserve memory, but it also makes the race itself feel less genuine and more artificial in terms of challenge. I'm not saying Mario Kart 64 is hard by any means, but you know something is off if I park my ass in place and the first placer up ahead is going uncompetitively slow. That is, until I catch up with them, do they resume their original competitive spirit. That is dumb. Why shouldn't they be able to lap me in a minute in this scenario? Because of rubber banding, that's why. And while it's not as noticeable in 50cc, you will, and I mean you will, notice it on 100cc and especially 150cc, and that can really hinder the potential fun of Mario Kart 64 because sometimes no matter how well you perform, the racer behind you will just magically catch up and rob you of your victory just when you're about to cross the finish line. So despite great items, the CPU is unfortunately plagued by awful rubber banding, and as a result, it kind of creates this glass ceiling of quality, meaning no matter how good it gets, it can't really go above and beyond that glass ceilings. And thankfully the items are still great, but what about the track designs? Well, I do have some things to say about that. And honestly, they're kind of basic, but not in a bad way. Due to the capabilities of 3D, the tracks already have way more going for them than even the best of Super Mario Kart's flat track designs. And better yet, all 4 cups are there at the start, not requiring any unlocking, so you can practice the special cup on 50cc and get used to the tracks before taking them on in 100cc. I know I praised Super Mario Kart originally for having that as an unlockable to give me something to work for, but at the same time, having all the tracks right at the start makes 64 more accessible of a game for new players, therefore having its own benefit. And the overall quality of these tracks doesn't flatline or even decrease the further you progress. The Mushroom Cup is what you expect from a starter cup. Luigi Raceway is about as traditional of a racetrack you can ask for to introduce players to the game, with its plethora of item boxes and not so demanding twists and turns. And Moo Moo Farms expands upon the simplistic idea and throws in environmental hazards like the Monty Moles that can knock the wind out of you. The game expects more out of the player with Koopa Troopa Beach and Calamari Desert. Sure, they're still really simple, but the beach has these really cool ramps that can really help the player reach a shortcut in an item box that's difficult to reach based on their own skill. And the desert track has this train that can block the intersection of the road and the tracks temporarily. So will you go off-road to get around the train before it meets with you? This adds some risk versus reward element to the track design. And these later stages are longer, but still retain that simple quality to them to finish off that cup. It's definitely the weakest of the cup solely for the simple track designs, but it's better to use that as a jumping off point for the rest of the cups, because the Flower Cup is where the game starts to really get interesting. Sure, the finisher track being Mario Raceway is just a longer, slightly harder version of Luigi Raceway, but even that is interesting due to the cup's tracks having more of a focus on environmental hazards, giving players more things to avoid and increasing the amount of satisfaction in finishing these races first. Like the piranha plants in Mario Raceway, as well as the snowmen in Frappe Snowland, the falling boulders in Choco Mountain, and especially in my favorite track of this cup being the cars in Toad Turnpike. These cars that you have to avoid hitting make this track so much fun to play through, because there's a lot to look out for and you have to be observant, but also points where you can cut in front of a car before the gap between it and the upcoming wall closes, giving you an occasional advantage over opponents with risk versus reward scenarios like this. Same can be said for Frappe Snowland and its narrow canyon, as well as Choco Mountain. Using these close-off spaces with items like the green shells can create a hectic scenario where they ricochet off the walls and could hit you, but also hit your opponents, making players wonder if they should go for it or hold off on it. Either way, Flower Cup is definitely my personal favorite set of tracks, but Star Cup doesn't really decline in quality or anything like that. It has some extremely high highs like Bowser's Castle, Sherbet Land, and Royal Raceway being some of my favorite tracks in the game for their harder but fair obstacle variety, like Bowser's Castle's thwomp enemies, Sherbet Land's patrolling penguins and ice physics, and Royal Raceway's water along some narrow paths. These 3 tracks are always a spectacle to behold, as I feel a rush of adrenaline going off this ramp and landing on the other side for Royal Raceway, and just avoiding the thwomps as they position themselves is terrifying, yet satisfying when you don't get crushed or blocked. And with all the praises sung, it should be my favorite cup, right? But then there's one of the worst tracks in the game, being Wario Stadium. It's just a long, boring collection of bumpy hills with nothing remotely interesting to say about it. I am not underselling it because what you see here is what you get. There's no staged obstacles like Monty Moles, as that would have been at least interesting. There's just item boxes and sharp turns, and that's it. And thank God it's the starter track for this cup, as I like to save the best tracks for last. This is such a waste of programming. It's so dreadfully boring, and it's kind of funny because the template for this track would later inspire Waluigi Stadium for Mario Kart Double Dash, and that track is honestly way better than this. This is just too long and there's not much to do to justify the length. Moving on to the hardest cup in the game, Special Cup. What can I say about it that hasn't been said already? It's arguably the most famous set of tracks due to how DK Jungle Parkway, Yoshi's Valley, and N64 Rainbow Road have been adapted into later installments as retro tracks. DK Jungle Parkway is one of the best courses for its grand scope, spectacle, jungle theme, difficulty of the twists and turns, and just being everything that works with Mario Kart 64 but upping the ante because it's so late in the game. And that's about all the positives I have for today. I mean, Banshee Boardwalk is okay, I guess. Nothing noteworthy other than 90-degree sharp turns of the boardwalk section. And look, bats that don't really do much other than provide resistance to the kart. Yay? And let me just say, Yoshi Valley is one of the more popular tracks of the game, but I think that's more popular because the adaptations of it in later games were really good, while this is just confusing. I mean, yeah, non-linearity is nice. I like my tracks to have diverging pathways that have risk versus reward elements about them, and given how this track is a giant canyon you can fall off of, there is a lot of risk. That's all fine and dandy, but what's not fine is having a map with all the racers, and the game doesn't really know who's in first. I mean, it does as indicated by the map, and the blue shell can track down who's first. So why is there question marks for the rankings? And then there's the Mario Kart 64 rendition of Rainbow Road. N64 Rainbow Road feels like the antithesis of Super Mario Kart's Rainbow Road. The original one had no guardrails, had really sharp turns that almost require braking for some racers. It was short and tested everything you knew. It still sucked though. N64 Rainbow Road, however, each lap is over 2 minutes long, and there's 3 laps total, making it a 6-minute long race. And aside from some ascensions and descensions on the track, as well as some twists and turns here and there, there's really not much in terms of challenge, aside from avoiding these zigzagging chain chomp enemies, but still feels like a really simple course that's just a war of attrition with the other racers to see who is the most patient enough to stay awake for the finish line. And as a result, it's a bit of a disappointing ending track. I mean, I'll gladly take it over the frustration that was the preceding Rainbow Road because of the generous real estate of the track, but if it was only 2 laps, removed some of the guardrails, maybe even had a risk versus reward shortcut here and there, that would have been a great way to end things off. But unfortunately, like Wario Stadium, its length kills it for me. It just highlights all the problems like the rubber banding AI and controls that leave a lot to be desired, on top of being extremely linear to the point where it's boring as I know the controls have improved since the last game, but it's still kind of awkward to control and could really use some fine-tuning for later installments. The previous game had some really slippery controls, especially noticeable with some racers, but in 64, they feel more stiff than they do slippery, which I actually find preferable, but still pretty weird and not exactly comfortable for me. Maybe it's because the sequels have a plethora of customization stats you can mess around with to your heart's content. While here, we are at the mercy of the 8 kart racers, but really, there's more like 3 different racers, with Peach, Toad, and Yoshi being lightweight racers that are the fastest but can be spun out by contacting heavyweight class racers, which comprise of Bowser, Wario, and Donkey Kong from the Donkey Kong Country series. And from here on out, Donkey Kong will appear in every Mario Kart game just so Nintendo can tell us, you see guys, we still care about this character. Just because we haven't given him a game in a while doesn't mean we don't care about him anymore. And as you would expect, the heavyweight class has the worst acceleration, but get a burst of speed when they reach their top speed, not to mention they can bump into smaller karts and never get spun out. And of course, Mario and Luigi are the medium weight class, which is of course the most well-rounded of the kart racers. Basically jacks of all trade, but masters of none. And all these karts, despite their specific class advantages, control just fine. I do find drifting easier with smaller karts than bigger ones, as to be expected, and despite the weird stiff feeling of the drift boosting, thankfully the karts aren't so slippery it feels like driving on a road covered with spilled frying oil, and I work in a kitchen, so I know just how slippery frying oil spills are. Drift boosting is the most fun move to pull off, even if it's less comfortable to do so than in later installments that just give a better sense of weight to the vehicle. Here, you have to drift until the exhaust turns red and release the drift button to get that sweet temporary boost, and it's surprising how many people don't know this technique, and for me, it honestly bumped up 64 a few rankings when it comes to the top 8 Mario Kart games. However, even with that feature, it's still either my second least favorite entry or third, depending on how much I'll enjoy Super Super Circuit when I replay that eventually. But regardless of which racer you select, they control fine enough, even if they're very rough around the edges. And interestingly enough, DK's slot was originally taken by Magic Koopa. I mean, in 1995, Yoshi's Island came out heavily featuring Kamek as a secondary antagonist, so it makes perfect sense he was a stand-in. Although, Donkey Kong Country 1 and 2 sold extremely well, so having the new Donkey Kong have a slot in Mario Kart 64 was a better choice in the long run, because as much as I love Magic Koopa, aka Kamek, I enjoy Donkey Kong as a character more than I do Magic Koopa. I don't know, for some reason I could just always relate to Donkey Kong. Not sure why. I'll have to think about that. So the single player experience isn't as meaty as I would like it to be, but I will say the game does have a nice soundtrack to go with their atmosphere. This was surprisingly not composed by Koji Kondo, but rather Kenta Nagata, as his first soundtrack on a Nintendo game, and for his debut, he already is giving Mr. Kondo a run for his money. I mean, the instrumentation is held back by the sound hardware of the cartridge-based Nintendo 64 console, meaning there's a lot of MIDI instrumentation and all of their compressed synthetic glory. But a good composer can make it work, and the Nintendo 64 saw no shortage of great composers, as I'm happy to say that games like Mario Kart 64 sit proudly with Banjo-Kazooie and Paper Mario in the fond memories of those who grew up with the console, or didn't but discovered it for themselves years later. Like, Moo Moo Farm of course has the stereotypical banjo-dominant motif associated with farms, but the addition of beach drums gives it a unique happy-go-lucky sound to it, while Koopa Troopa Beach is more subdued and chill to give a more relaxing vibe to it with quieter beach drums, and Calamari Desert has a similar idea with tribal drums, keyboard, and flute samples, just to suit the more open track designs. Frappe Snowland is similar except with a tambourine, keyboard, and xylophone to give it a childlike sense of wonder to these winter-themed tracks. While Bowser's Castle theme has low choir samples howling in an intimidating melody to induce a sense of fear in this hellish castle. And Banshee Boardwalk is just terrifying, despite it being a xylophone played in high tempo, but just something about it compositionally makes me paranoid as hell, and just foreshadows something unknown that is to be feared. Nagata just knows how to repurpose a common music motif and create his own thing with it, and for that, Mario Kart 64 has arguably the most unique style and substance to it compared to other games in the series. That's not to say that there aren't some weak links among these compositions. The raceway themes don't do anything for me instrumentally, but they go fine with the raceways they're on, conveying the fast-paced nature of these F1 style tracks. And the battle theme doesn't really get me pumped up to take down my opponent like I should be feeling, and it's very repetitive with its repeating keyboard riff every measure like ah. But that doesn't stop me from remembering my favorite themes, being Rainbow Road for being the very essence of happiness and optimism with its keyboard and flute, as well as Toad Turnpike for its high tempo composition with a really cool bass line and electronic influence. Kenta Nagata made a very strong first impression here, and thankfully he had a pretty decent career at Nintendo afterwards. And with all that said, thank you all so much for watching, and remember to stay...
Wait! That's it?
I think I covered all the bases. Like, what else is there to talk about?
I think you know the one big selling point of Mario Kart 64.
Oh, of course. How could I forget? Time trial. It exists. Super Mario Kart had one as well. Just beat the tracks under a certain time, except without the items and without the other racers, making it the least exciting feature. I'm sure some people like it, but then again, some people like pickled pork lips. There, I covered the time trials. Are you happy?
No! The multiplayer, you no-talent ass clown!
Oh, right. The multiplayer. The multiplayer was hyped up to hell and back, and while I would normally find it not worth experiencing given how my lack of a social life tends to create this weird situation where I don't have a second player, like, ever, but I got a friend to play, and it's as fun as you would expect. Grand Prix is more fun with a friend, just like the last game, and I know I was negative about Super Mario Kart's lackluster battle mode, but let me just say that the Nintendo 64 iteration is freaking fun. It's just one-on-one, and the split screen allows you to see what your friend is doing and where they might be, but the aura of suspense tends to force me to pay attention to what I am doing. Oh, you son of a bitch! I'm gonna pound you!
How you gonna do that? We're playing online, and we're states away!
Oh, you are so lucky my job doesn't pay me enough to book a flight to your town and teach you a lesson in the School of Hard Knocks. And because this is a full 3D game and not a flat Mode 7 surface, there's plenty of places to hide and take cover, making Battle Mode a feature meant to be played in true 3D, as opposed to Super Mario Kart's dreadfully boring Battle Mode. And I am so going to dread Super Circuit's Battle Mode, if it has one. I'd imagine it'd be like the Super Mario Kart version. With Mario Kart 64, I wasn't blown away by it, but I didn't leave this playthrough hating it either. Yes, the rubber banding is bad. Yes, the track designs are more basic compared to later installments, with some even overstaying their welcome. Yes, the art style is very inconsistent, and yes, the controls can be rather stiff feeling, but it all comes together as a okay game despite its core flaws. I still had fun zipping through the tracks now knowing how to drift boost, and the use of the items is never not thrilling. It really is the wide assortment of weapons that kind of puts this game slightly higher than the average racing game for me. So despite Mario Kart 64 being far from great and has definitely been outdone even by the following year of its release, it's definitely not terrible and a small step forward the series needed. But forgive me if I say if you're new to the series, I don't recommend starting out with this, but instead Mario Kart Double Dash, as that's when the series began to get good, like really good. Until then, I wouldn't recommend skipping these games, but save them for last just to pique your morbid curiosity, because I don't think these games are as polished as the later ones. Do your worst.
Happy New Year, you filthy animal son of a bitch! Ha 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 ha!
Incoming message from Planet Claire. Incoming message from Planet Claire.
Hello, 'tis I, the fetch question gentleman. I've been racking my brain lately. And you know why? I'm sick and tired of that no good, low down, dirty side question gentleman getting all the good attention. What about my recognition for all my hard work, huh? I want to point something out to all of you, especially you, side questing gentlemen. I was the Frosty Walrus. SQG wasn't the Frosty Walrus. I was just saying that to be nice, but I was actually the Frosty Walrus.